Listen carefully, because the next 8 seconds were never meant to escape the sealed archives of Ascension Parish. A widow's trembling handwriting, a clerk's warning carved into the margin, and a single forbidden sentence whispered behind locked doors. The wrong man died that night. If you feel a chill in your spine right now, good. That's your instinct recognizing a truth powerful men spent generations burying. The kind of truth that rewires a man the moment he hears it. Because the story Moses' story does not begin with triumph, or vengeance, or even rebellion. It begins with a silence so heavy it warped the walls of a Louisiana plantation house in the summer of 1852. A silence that followed a gunshot no one admitted hearing. But understand this, Moses was not born a legend. He was forged into one. A child trained by necessity to read the world like a cipher faces, gestures, fears. A boy forced to learn power by studying it from underneath its boot. He memorized every ledger line his master traced, every lie the overseers told, every flaw in the machinery human and mechanical that ran the plantation. While other men in that era mistook strength for brutality, Moses understood something far more dangerous. The geometry of influence. The angles between desire and fear. The pressure points inside a hierarchy that had convinced itself it could never break. You need to picture this place, Bellara Plantation, rising out of the dark Mississippi soil like a monument to a system older than the nation itself. Live oaks strangled by Spanish moss. Galleries echoing with conversations about profit and politics, while the people who produced that wealth moved like shadows beneath them. But in those shadows Moses was studying, calculating, evolving. And the master, Henri Beauchamp, he made a fatal mistake. He thought intelligence belonged to bloodlines. He believed loyalty could be purchased with proximity. So he pulled Moses close, too close. Close enough to see the cracks in his accounts, the private desperation behind his aristocratic confidence, the weakness behind his authority. By the time the summer heat began crushing the plantation like a fist, Moses already understood the truth Henri never saw coming. Power isn't inherited. It's taken. And when the night came that ended with a rifle, a locked door, and a body slumped over a desk, nothing about Bellara Plantation would ever be the same again. The night Henri Beauchamp died, something shifted in the air, something subtle, but undeniable. Old Jacques, the cook, later told investigators that even the cicadas outside the kitchen windows went silent for a moment, as if nature itself was holding its breath. In a world built on routines, silence is never accidental. It's a signal, a tremor, a warning that someone has just crossed a line they can never step back over. Think about that locked study door. Think about the single lamp burning long past midnight, flickering against papers Moses had organized earlier that day: debts, contracts, plantation maps. Think about the rifle Henri kept above his desk, a weapon he never cleaned himself, a weapon Moses had once repaired. Now imagine the master sitting alone while the house slept. Except not entirely. Someone else was awake. Someone else had a key. And someone else understood exactly what Henri feared most. When Louisa pushed open the study door and screamed, it wasn't just from horror. It was from recognition. She knew this was not a suicide. She knew the angle of the wound was wrong. She knew Henri was left-handed. Yet the rifle lay across his right knee like a prop arranged for an audience that would never ask the right questions. But that audience didn't matter. What mattered were the faces in the doorway: Moses, calm and unreadable; Celeste, pale and trembling; the Greenleaf brothers, hungry for blame; Margot, watching everything like a mirror no one dared look into. In the chaos that followed, Moses said almost nothing. He didn't raise his voice, didn't command, didn't plead. He simply observed, measured, calculated. And in that stillness, one truth became unavoidable. He understood more about this scene than anyone else in the room. But here's what you must understand: this story is not about murder. It's about leverage. And Henry's death was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. A rupture in the plantation's power structure that exposed a truth most men spend their whole lives refusing to see. Institutions are fragile. Authority is performative. And the moment the man at the top falls, every hierarchy underneath begins scrambling for a new center of gravity. The Greenleaf brothers wanted control. Celeste wanted safety. The parish officials wanted the problem to disappear. But Moses wanted something none of them could imagine. He wanted the entire system to kneel. When dawn crept over Bellara Plantation the morning after Henry's death, it didn't rise gently. It arrived like an interrogation light revealing everything, forgiving nothing. And for the first time in decades, there was no master to walk the galleries, no voice to command the day's labor, no anchor holding the hierarchy in place. Power hates a vacuum. Nature hates a void. And in that fragile space between shock and opportunity, men reveal who they truly are. Tobias Greenleaf tried to seize control first. He stormed into the main house with the swagger of a man who believed whiteness alone entitled him to authority. He demanded records, keys, access to the safe. But when Louisa informed him quietly, firmly, that Moses had already secured the accounting room at Celeste's request, Tobias faltered. It was subtle, a blink, a hesitation. But in the world of power, hesitation is blood in the water. Celeste emerged hours later dressed in morning black, her eyes red but her expression strangely composed. The parish officials questioned her, asked about Henry's temperament, his debts, his mood. She answered softly, carefully, never once looking toward Moses. And yet every word she spoke was shaped by his presence. Even then, she knew something no one else would admit. Henry's death had rearranged the center of the universe, and Moses was now the only person who understood the map. But there was another layer, one the parish clerks whispered about later. Something in the way Celeste held herself around Moses. Something in the way she deferred to him, not as a servant, not as an advisor, but as a man whose gravity she couldn't escape. Rumors flickered through the quarters like sparks through dry cane. Some said Celeste had sought Moses's guidance long before Henri died. Others claimed the marriage license clerk's note, "God have mercy on us all," referred not to blasphemy, but to fear. Meanwhile, Moses moved with deliberate silence. He filed documents before anyone could contest them. He cataloged debts Henri owed, debts Henri was owed, and interests hidden beneath layers of polite Southern bookkeeping. He visited the sugar mill. He inspected the fields. He walked the property as though he were taking inventory of a kingdom he'd already envisioned ruling. But the overseers saw it differently. To them, Moses's composure wasn't intelligence, it was threat. And nothing terrifies a man who depends on the hierarchy more than watching someone step outside the role they were assigned. Because deep down, every man at Bellara knew the same truth. If Moses truly understood the levers of power, he didn't need permission to pull them. In the days that followed Henry's death, Bellara Plantation did not mourn, it watched. Every pair of eyes, from the loft of the sugar mill to the quiet corners of the main house, tracked Moses's movements. People sensed something shifting, something violating the unwritten laws of the Old South. They couldn't name it, but they felt it, like humidity rising before a storm, like static gathering before a lightning strike. The Greenleaf brothers felt it most. Tobias muttered that Moses was too calm. Samuel whispered about the locked ledgers, the sealed documents Celeste signed without letting the overseers read them. Their suspicions weren't based on evidence, they were based on fear. The kind of primal fear men feel when a system they depend on begins slipping from their grasp. They'd always believed control flowed downward, white overseer, master slave. But that ladder was cracking, and in the cracks they saw Moses. On the third day, a closed inquiry convened in the parlor. Parish officials stayed only long enough to confirm what they needed to confirm. A white planter was dead. There were no white suspects, and the alternative that a slave could manipulate or eliminate a master was unthinkable. So they clung to the story laid before them like desperate men clinging to driftwood. Henri, overwhelmed by debts and stress, had taken his own life. Case closed. Files sealed. Order preserved. Yet behind the officials' polite reassurances, the deeper truth lurked. Henri had been unraveling for months. Letters showed mounting financial pressure. Private accounts revealed risky land bets. And Celeste knew the coldness in her husband's eyes long before the coroner's report contradicted the official version. But here's what you must understand. Moses didn't challenge the narrative. He didn't need to. While others scrambled to reinforce the old hierarchy, he quietly built a new one nobody recognized until it was already too late. He visited the factors in New Orleans, carrying documents with Henry's seal documents he and Henri had prepared together. He negotiated extensions, restructured debts, shifted assets. And he did it with the calm precision of a man who had studied the art of power his entire life. He spoke to Celeste only in private, and every time she emerged from those conversations, she looked less like a grieving widow and more like a woman preparing for a future only Moses could see. Meanwhile, the overseers plotted. They whispered about taking corrective action. They believed violence could restore the old order. But Moses understood the fatal flaw in their thinking. Men who cling to authority always underestimate those who learn in silence. The first real fracture in Bellara's hierarchy came quietly, so quietly that the men who caused it never realized they had already lost. It began with a meeting behind the sugar mill, where Tobias and Samuel Greenleaf gathered 3 other overseers from neighboring estates. They whispered about restoring order, about putting the uppity slave back in his place, about forcing Celeste to hand over the ledgers Moses controlled. They believed their anger made them dangerous. They had no idea it made them predictable. Because while they schemed in the shadows, Moses moved in daylight methodically, patiently, with the intelligence of a man who had spent 30 years studying how power consumes itself. He didn't need to confront the overseers. He needed only to let them act, and let their own impulses destroy them. The collapse began with Tobias. He confronted Celeste in the gallery, demanding access to Henry's correspondence. Moses didn't intervene. He simply watched from the far end of the hall, silent, expression unreadable. Celeste didn't flinch. She told Tobias, in a voice steady enough to shake the walls, that Moses, not the overseers, would manage plantation affairs until the estate was legally settled. For Tobias, that humiliation was intolerable. And men who cannot tolerate humiliation often make fatal mistakes. That night, someone loosened the bolts on the steam-powered cane press in the mill. Someone else, whether intentionally or not, left a lamp burning dangerously close to a vat of drying cane fiber. Moses noticed both, and he knew exactly what the overseers were planning. Sabotage, staged accidents, intimidation, the same tactics white men had used for generations to crush dissent from below. But there was a truth the overseers refused to accept. Moses was not below them anymore. Not in intelligence, not in influence, and certainly not in resolve. 2 nights later, Samuel Greenleaf was found dead near the edge of the property. The officials called it a drunken fall from his horse. But everyone at Bellara knew Samuel didn't drink. And they knew something else. He had intended to confront Moses that night. Intimidate him, maybe worse. When the news spread through the quarters, the slaves didn't celebrate. But they didn't grieve either. They simply looked toward the main house, toward the balcony where Moses stood at dawn, motionless, watching the river roll past like time itself. And this is where you must pay attention, because we're now halfway into the descent, and if you're still here, you're not just watching a story, you're undergoing a shift in identity. Comment this phrase twice to lock it in. Power answers only to understanding. Now we go deeper. After Samuel Greenleaf's death, Bellara Plantation moved with the quiet tension of a battlefield. After the first volley, every sound amplified, every silence suspicious. Power had shifted, not with a proclamation but with an outcome. And in the Old South, outcomes were the only truth that mattered. The overseers didn't say Moses's name. They avoided meeting his eyes. They lowered their voices when he passed. Not because they believed he'd killed Samuel, but because they no longer believed he couldn't. Fear rewrites hierarchies far faster than law ever could. Tobias, shaken and newly aware of his own mortality, attempted diplomacy. He approached Moses near the stables, offering condolences, offering support, offering the kind of cooperation men only extend when they understand the other hand holds the real leverage. Moses listened without a word. Not a nod, not a gesture, not a single sign that Tobias's pleas mattered. Because by then, they didn't. The truth was simple. Tobias had already chosen his path the moment he tried to intimidate Celeste. Everything after that was just noise, echoes of a man trying to claw back relevance in a world that had already moved on without him. Meanwhile, Celeste's transformation became impossible to ignore. She walked the galleries with posture sharpened by resolve, no longer shrinking from whispers or judgment. Servants began addressing her not with pity but with deference, sensing an authority in her that Henri had crushed but Moses had uncovered. She still wore mourning black, but it no longer looked like grief, it looked like armor. And at the center of it all was Moses, operating with the precision of a man who saw 10 moves ahead. He reorganized the mill, streamlined the harvest schedule, renegotiated contracts. The slaves noticed his efficiency. The neighbors noticed his results. The parish noticed his uncanny ability to stabilize an estate that should have collapsed. But the most unsettling detail came from letters exchanged among Creole families in New Orleans. They spoke of Celeste's frequent trips into town with Moses. They spoke of the widow who refused to remarry within her caste, and yet arrived at every meeting with a man the law had once considered property. And then came the marriage license. 40 days after Henry's funeral, Celeste Beauchamp and Moses' no surname listed appeared before the parish clerk. That clerk, a man who had filed hundreds of documents without comment, wrote only 5 words in the margin. God have mercy on us all. Those words spread like wildfire, not because a black man married a white widow, but because everyone knew what that marriage meant. The old order wasn't breaking. It was bowing. They say history ends where the maps turn blank. But the truth is that the darkest stories begin there. And tonight, we return to the place the old surveyors refused to name. The place where the boundary markers were torn out of the soil as if by something that did not want to be contained. Because after months of silence, he finally reached it. The forgotten ridge the locals warned him never to cross. The place woven with legends so old that even the elders only whispered them. He carries with him the relic he was never meant to hold. The one carved from stone that shouldn't exist. The one etched with symbols not found in any earthly script. Symbols that shift when no one is watching. For the first time since he stole it from the ruin, the air grows heavy. The forest tilts, the world leans inward, and he feels the presence before he sees it. A pressure behind the ribs, as if something ancient is knocking politely from the wrong side of his heartbeat. The stories all agreed on one thing. You do not bring the relic home. It brings itself. A low hum vibrates through the ground. The same tone described in colonial journals, in slave narratives, in cryptic missionary letters that ended abruptly after this passage. When the stone sings, you must run. If you do not run, you must kneel. And then, in the center of the clearing, he finally sees it. The altar. The one believed destroyed in the rebellion centuries ago. But standing here, untouched, as if it has been waiting, he approaches. The hum grows louder. The trees tremble. Somewhere in the darkness, he hears voices. Not ghosts, not spirits. Memory. Memory so old it's become the land itself. Whispering in languages no longer spoken. Chanting in rhythms that feel like they're rearranging the bones inside his chest. And with every step, the truth he's chased, the truth that cost others their lives, rises like a tide. This was never a treasure, never a key, never a symbol of power. It was a warning, and he has failed to understand it. Because the altar is glowing, the relic is vibrating, and the hum is no longer a whisper, but a voice, calling him by name. At first, there is only darkness, the kind that folds around a person like wet cloth, sealing them into a moment they cannot escape. But then, something moves, not ahead of him, not behind him, inside him. The voice that called his name does not echo. It blossoms, spreading through his thoughts like roots through abandoned soil. You brought back what was stolen. The relic in his hands ignites, not with fire but with memory. Images burst behind his eyes, rituals carried out under storms with no source, monoliths carved by hands that were not entirely human, bloodless offerings left on stone altars by people who prayed not for mercy, but for distance. They weren't worshipping something, they were holding it back. He stumbles, clutching his skull as knowledge he was never meant to carry forces its way in. The altar wasn't a shrine. It was a lock. The relic wasn't a treasure. It was the key. And the ones who buried this history weren't villains. They were the last line of defense. But he has brought the key straight to the door. The humming stops. A silence explodes outward, so sharp it feels like a blade pressed to the world. Then the altar cracks. A thin line of red light bleeds upward, slicing the night open like a wound. The forest recoils. Even the wind retreats. He realizes, far too late, that the legends didn't say the entity would rise. They said it would remember. And tonight, under a sky suddenly stripped of stars, it does. A shape emerges. Not monstrous, not grotesque, but recognizable. Human in outline, ancient in presence. A silhouette carved from the planet's oldest shadow. It doesn't walk toward him. The world shifts so that he is closer to it. You carry the guilt of those who freed me. It raises a hand. The relic disintegrates into ash. The altar collapses into dust. The lock is gone. And as the clearing fills with an impossible dawn, a light with no warmth, no source, no mercy, he understands that history did not forget this place. History fled from it. And now, nothing stands between the world and what the old ones sealed away. If this descent chilled you, hit like so the algorithm understands you're ready for more. Subscribe for weekly Forbidden History investigations, and comment the moment you realize this story crossed the line between legend and truth. Your engagement keeps this channel from disappearing into the archives they don't want us to open.